Welcome to my Managing Learning Environments Assessment Task 2. My 5 pedagogical keys are: building respectful relationships. The process of building strong relationships with students is crucial. Teachers need to conduct themselves in ways they would like to see their students' behaviour mirror. This means that their behaviour and demeanour always needs to be calm, safe, positive and friendly. Students can be directors of their own learning. This only occurs with the right mentoring and by setting a safe and positive environment through students trusting their relationship with their teacher, with communication being the key to building these relationships. This dialogue and relationship building can be established and built on throughout the days, weeks and months of the school year through games, conversations and class activities such as role-playing. COPE 2007. Students should also be able to relate to their teacher as a person as well as a mentor. Routines such as having conversations about interest or extracurricular activities should be held regularly with students in downtime. Opportunities for these conversations may arise at the start of the day, during eating time at lunch, or while waiting for parents to pick up students. This is also a good opportunity to build relationships with parents by getting them involved in the conversation. Teachers should know students' personalities, home lives, and interests. And it is also a key to understanding how a student learns academically, socially, and emotionally. It helps to tailor classes with content that interests and engages them. It also gives information on what format and tools will most engage their learning pathway. Having a knowledge of both students' inward and external difficulties to learning also helps the teacher understand to best overcome these hurdles. Students knowing their teacher as a person helps them feel confident in coming to them with issues or problems. As previously discussed, teachers need to always be an exemplar for behaviour in the classroom. This means they need to clearly assert themselves as the teacher without humiliating students, losing their temper, and always having a positive attitude in all situations. COPE 2007. Open and respectful relationships should be built with parents and carers also, through communication in diaries, phone calls and face-to-face meetings. Informal connections as described above, school pickups, are also a good way of building relationships between the three parties, student, teacher and parent. Building student self-discipline, resourcefulness and resilience. I want to link these three areas of building social learning skills. Self-discipline, the inner structure of how to think and act before a given circumstance. Resourcefulness, the ability to think and use tools to react at the time of a circumstance. And resilience, the way to reflect, acknowledge and move on from a circumstance. These three elements are all based around the student's internal contextual reasoning, generalizations and rationales based around the class, school and wider community. Cefe Cavioni, 2013. Self-discipline is all about students making the right choices for themselves and others within the school. As a pre-service teacher, I feel it is vital that students understand their responsibilities to themselves and others, acting respectfully and responsibly within their learning environment. This includes having an understanding of others' rights to a safe learning environment, and as well as other students' right to learn. Teaching students to think before they act in a certain circumstances, as well as behaving in a way in accordance with the guidelines set up by the class and school community. Resourcefulness is much more about the teacher setting up an environment where students know and use a variety of tools and people such as teachers, peers and parents, as well as obviously their own abilities to solve problems within this context. In Assessment Task 2, I referred to a class I conducted early on in my placement. The class revolved around students grasping the concept of which problems they could be resourceful enough to solve by themselves, opposed to problems they needed adult intervention. This class set me up with a tool to get students to think about how they could solve their own issues within smaller and more trivial contexts. When students would ask for help on something I knew they could solve themselves, my response would be, is that a big problem or a little problem? This was a cue for the students to find their own way of solving the problem they had presented me. Students in my placement class often work through scenarios of varying importance through role play, giving them greater appreciation of degrees of importance that were then used in context with real-life comparables. An example of this was a student being accidentally hurt in a basketball game during a PE class. Their initial reaction was to assume it was a deliberate action. The offending student immediately apologised for the accidental bump. The injured student's internal reasoning immediately kicked in on the apology. The two students brushed off the incident and continued playing. In this example, I could clearly see that both students had been groomed for this situation. I could see the internal change of mind, especially in the student who was bumped, and how the teaching of resilience and self-discipline had influenced his thinking. Obviously, these three key social development tools need to be developed within a scaffold of understanding in mind. Students need to know the limits of their capabilities and understand when a problem or an issue is too big for them to handle alone. This is when adult intervention is required to help them, be it a parent, teacher, or another trusted adult. Democratic community classroom. The building of students' relationships with teachers and peers, as well as their social education through building self-discipline and resilience, are a cornerstone of setting up a democratic community in the classroom. It is my firm belief that as a prospective teacher, I am responsible in part for creating good citizens. So to structure a classroom that works in any other way than that of the society at large would be disingenuous. Like in any society, the classroom has both rights and responsibilities. Like in any democratic society, all members of the community have a say regarding these guidelines. Students are far more likely to both choose and understand to uphold their responsibilities if they had a hand in creating them. Besides, what kind of respectful relationship dictates a person's choice in a democratic community? Glasser, 1997, suggests that students can only control their own behaviour. Through choosing to work within the classroom community, students and the teacher can build safe, positive learning environments. Teachers play a vital role in both creating, protecting, and involving the community-based democracy in the classroom. This societal-based learning environment allows students to make choices, and these choices made by the students all have consequences, for good or for bad. Just as in a society, students can choose to adhere to guidelines of their responsibilities or choose not to. The consequences for not fulfilling these responsibilities have been fully mapped out and collaborated with the class. Like in wider society, fail to adhere to your responsibilities and you lose some of your rights. Rogers suggests that this can be applied to a whole class. If learning and behavioural responsibilities are not being met, then rights to have a say in the classroom rules and activities are diminished. The community aspect of my learning environment sees the class, including the teacher, as being positive, supportive and safe. The teacher sets up an environment where students can learn off each other and become resources for each other to work collaboratively for all to learn. A good community is also inclusive to all. No one in the classroom community should feel left out, isolated from the group. Routines and rituals should constantly recognise and reward learning achievements to all within the classroom community. Within the class, individual achievements are also group achievements. This community focus extends to the wider school community at large. Parents, other classes and teachers fall into that wider community. They also need to be respected and used as resources for social and academic learning. High expectations of students. Obviously, it's unrealistic to expect that every student will or can achieve the same academic standard. In this aspect of the classroom, it is up to the teacher to devise lesson plans that cater for all students within the class, as well as managing tasks that are challenging but not too hard for each student. A teacher needs to constantly use praise and positivity towards their students and their abilities, whilst pushing them to be constantly challenged with their learning. During my placement in a small literacy unit, I devised an activity where students linked their sustainability lessons with their creative writing. Knowing there were differences in literacy development within the grade 2 class, I devised a lesson plan that would see each student finish their assessment with the exact same task. The road, however, to get to this final comic strip picture story was adjusted depending on the students' literacy capabilities. Students with satisfactory literacy proficiency were asked to write about their sustainability, superhero, and a narrative before being allowed to draw any comic strip. While students who had a harder time writing descriptively were encouraged to start drawing first before working in an intensive unit with a teacher to create written descriptions of their character and narrative. In essence, nobody within the classroom community was exempt from completing the task. Students all completed the same item of work for assessment. All students were engaged in working hard on creating their character and narrative relative to the topic, through different routes that suited them the best learning pathway for each student and their capabilities. Standardised expectations for all can be implemented when it comes to behavioural and effort-based learning. Students should always be pushed to push past their current academic understanding. And in a community-based classroom, the whole class is responsible for supporting and positively encouraging the learning for everyone. The teacher's expectation of behaviours that respect everybody's right to learn and grow are also important. Expectations are high on students who have committed to an agreed set tasks and rules, and that guidelines need to be followed. Expectations with both behaviour and academics need to be clearly communicated by the teacher. Students should never be in any doubt about what expectations of them are in any situation. Ruby Davies 2007 argues that high expectations also need to be realistic while being relevant to the student's development. Engaging content. Working as a teacher aide in a northern suburban secondary school, I've had the opportunity to observe multiple classes and teachers from Year 7 till 10 over many different subjects. Many of the teachers that had a great classroom management style had a variety of activities, tasks and projects in their classroom. Their learning activities tend not to be predictable from class to class. The use of technology is prevalent within the class, with students responding and engaging in positive ways. This is not to say there are not necessary procedural textbook classes. They just tend to be in one in three rather than every class. Double period classes will be broken up into 2 or 3 activities, quite often with the less engaging content first, with the more interactive activities to finish the class. Students actively get involved in tasks that are relevant to them and deal with real-world scenarios, quite often coming up with insightful and individual answers and solutions to the activities or problems presented. Even with the more procedural activities, students in these classes tend to be more engaged in as their conceptual ideas and understanding have been formed, thus creating a link to the textbook learning. Alternatively, a lot of the teachers I see struggling with classroom management and control tend to have predictable and less engaging content in their classes. Quite often, every class follows the same format, usually using textbooks, which involve reading a section, then answering the following 10 to 15 questions. Often the level of engagement of the students is low, with a large percentage of the class. Disruptions and general lack of focus on the task are common. Another percentage of students will complete their tasks, but their grasp of the concepts and content is quite often questionable when asked about the topic. In essence, whether it be consciously or unconsciously, the students recognise the work and care that has gone into the planning of the unit and lesson plans is not ideal. If the teacher has not put much effort or enthusiasm into planning the subject, how can the students be expected to learn with any interest or engagement? This also links to the teacher managing the classroom. Engaged students are far less likely to misbehave or not participate. The respect shown to the student by putting effort and creating an engaging unit and/or lesson plan is again either consciously or unconsciously acknowledged by the class. The content of a lesson goes a long way to managing the classroom environment. As a teacher, putting the work into a unit or a lesson plan is going to save you a lot of time and effort when it comes to classroom management, encouraging students to be engaged and learn. Personally, as a teacher, I find the challenge of finding and creating lessons that are engaging and inclusive for all students, as well as being adaptable for both extending and enabling, is something I find rewarding and challenging all at the same time. It's also a creative outlet for my own well-being.